Alverstoke Antiviral blasts into orbit as we have issues with Colin's internet, and we look at the book of Nahum. You're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Well, hello, Colin.
Hi there, Andy.
Ground control to Major Colin.
Yep. I'm spaced out today.
Yeah, you seem a bit spaced out. Colin, let's start our time together by re-chewing the Sunday sermon. And I've got some questions for you. So we were looking at Matthew chapter 12. And that's a passage that starts with a question. The Pharisees say to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you." But Jesus took that as a bad question to be asking, didn't he?
Yes.
And I was surprised by that. Is it really a bad question? Asking for miraculous proof before believing? I mean, isn't that a reasonable question to ask?
It depends, in part, it depends where your heart is. We do see people occasionally asking for signs or delivering them in the Bible. But these guys, they've been questioning Jesus about how he's been able to do the miracles that he's performed. And it may be that they're pondering that he's got this power to drive out demons, this power to heal people as a personal sort of and special gift. They seem to be looking for something to descend from heaven itself. I suppose a little bit like the manna or something else like that, but a visible, tangible thing that doesn't come from him but comes down from above. Now, we know from what we've looked at in Matthew that Jesus has come down from above and been incarnated, but they just seem to be questioning him and his authority and not trusting who he is and what he's doing. And there's an element, I think, of wanting him to dance to their tune, to control him in the sort of things that he does in front of them. Jesus had a similar sort of temptation in the desert by the devil. So I think that's why it's a bad thing, in their case, asking for these signs at this particular time. Because it's not about signs, it's about trusting in the person. And they should have ample evidence from what Jesus has been doing already, not to require anything of such a seismic nature to convince them that he's the one he says he is. Yeah. Did you have to come back on that at all? It is a little bit difficult, isn't it? Because we think of the miraculous signs or miraculous acts as signs. So it sounds a little bit like wanting more of the same.
Yeah. I suppose when you realise how much they've already seen, it takes on a slightly different thing, doesn't it? Yeah.
And Jesus has sort of never been one just to, show off power. His miracles are directed, generally speaking, for the needs of people out of compassion. And they're just asking for something extraordinary for the sake of it.
I see. So, Colin, you use the image of Jesus's almost parable where he talks about a messy house in the passage. He talks about a house that's been swept clean and the demon going back in and messing it all up again. Can you spell out for us what Jesus is actually talking about? What's the house? What's the cleaning? What's the return? Is this something that could happen to us if we're Christians?
So Jesus is addressing all of his listeners, I think, at this point, the generation that's around, and the generation that we have seen resisting his message and resisting the evidence of what he's been doing. He starts off by talking about the demon coming out of a person, and then shifts the illustration to the spirit having coming out of the house. What he's describing here, I think, is characteristic of what has been happening with Jesus. He has been driving out demons. He has, as it were, swept out the evil spirits from all sorts of people's lives, and the disciples have done the same thing. And the purpose for that was not just to make a sort of moral reformation, though it seems to be implied that was what happened to some degree in that area. but he's driving out demons so that those people might receive him and take him into the center of their lives, and through faith in him and from obedience in him, actually receive a new spirit, be born again, and be indwelt by his spirit. But the people just seem very resistant to Jesus, getting to the heart of them. It's almost like they've put on armored plating to avoid him entering, or it's like one of these American apartments, with multiple locks on the inside of the door. They don't mind the flat being tidy, but they don't want Jesus to come in and change it around in the way that he's been talking about. And it's because of that sort of emptiness of response to Jesus, and an emptiness of God in Christ dwelling in them, that causes Jesus to give them a severe warning that this will happen to them as a generation if they continue to reject him, that their last state will be worse than when he first found them. As to Christians, I don't think this is speaking primarily to Christians. He's talking to a whole mixed group of people. I certainly don't believe that a person could be indwelt by a spirit and by the Spirit of God. It's one or other. Jesus doesn't accommodate evil and evil spirits, and therefore I don't think Christians who put their faith in Christ should worry about spirits having a undue influence over them. In Christ and in trust in him and through what he's done on the cross, we have been given the resources to keep such things out of our lives.
Right. Our third question is about the thing Jesus says right at the end of the passage, because he says, here are my mother and my brothers, and he points to his disciples. So what relationship should there be between our earthly families, relatives to our families through Jesus? How do those two things relate? How should they fit together?
That's a nice question, Andy. Thank you. So I think Jesus is talking about a family that actually lasts forever. And that's a group of people who trust what Jesus says, receive the words of God through Jesus, and allow them to shape our wills so that we do what the Father wants. So that's a family characterized, if you want, by the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, God the Father. And it has a permanence to it beyond the grave and right through this life. Now, we are to take care of our earthly families. If we don't do that, we're worse than an unbeliever, we're told by James, the brother of Jesus, because everybody has a bond of blood to lesser or greater degrees that they honour. And we too are to honour our physical family, our bloodline, and care for them. That's a responsibility that has been placed upon us as family. But there are times when loyalties can be stretched between the two, because sometimes families who wouldn't understand necessarily what it is to be Christian put pressure on other family members to follow in their direction. And we do, when it comes down to it, have to make sure that we follow what the Lord has said and uphold what is right in his side, even when family might be seeking to push us to go in a different direction. Ultimately, our allegiance, if we're a believer, is to God. But under God, we have a responsibility to care for our family, give time to them, love them as well. So they are subsidiary, but should never be forgotten or neglected. Well, and it seems in there that it's mother and brothers. It seems to point to them being outside, whereas those who are Jesus' family, because they do the will of the Father, are inside. Yeah.
Right. Well, Colin, thank you for those thoughtful comments. We are now going to go to our book of the week, which is the book of Nahum. And Colin, you're going to take us through this.
I am. That's my intention anyway. You're going to show the PowerPoint. There we are. There's the first slide. Nahum. I looked up Nahum because, as we'll see from what is written here, not every chapter mentions Nineveh, but Nineveh is mentioned from chapter 2 onwards. And so therefore, because we looked at Jonah the other week, I thought I'd try and see the relationship of the two. So Nahum probably is about 100 years after Jonah and his ministry. So the reason I looked that up was because there was a reformation amongst the Ninevites previously, and it's important to get this in context that they've gone back to their roots, as it were. They're still a violent and cruel nation in the time of Nahum, and we don't know exactly where about Elko was. There's different suggestions. Nahum may well be part of the exiled people out of Israel, but we don't know. So he's writing, I think, around 660 years or so before Jesus, and he's speaking about Nineveh, which is outside Mosul in modern-day Iraq. Now, let's have a look at chapter 1. One of the things that is said there early on in chapter 1 is the Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. He goes on in verse 5, which is the next slide, and that the mountains quake before him and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. And then verse 6, but the Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. And I think in chapter 1, no mention of Nineveh. Well, it does mention it down in verse 8, but in the first 7 verses, no mention of Nineveh. We're getting very clearly the character of God being portrayed as not only one who brings about what people deserve for their wickedness, and he can do that in history, in time, as well as at the final judgment, but he's also a God at the same time who is angry at the injustices that nations are doing and controlling and influencing, and he's speaking to them very firmly here that there is a God, that the God is who is slow to anger, but is angry at what he sees going on in Nineveh, as the book will make clear. If we just go on to the next slide, I put those verse 4 and verse 6 up there, and then verse 5 sort of nestles in between if you do the next clicker, just to remind us that the two aspects being mentioned here that should cause us to fear God is he has a slowness to anger, but he is great in power, and that he will not leave the guilty unpunished. Justice will be done and will be meted out. And the other verse is sort of the flip side to those who trust in God, that the Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. And these two sort of brought together should give us a insight into his character and his and the reaction that we should make to him, in that we should quake before him. So that's sort of the setting of chapter 1 of Nahum. Did I say Malachi earlier? Nahum. Right, if we go on to the next slide, this one says, the terrifying power and wrath of God, yet he shows goodness to those who trust him. And I would put that, and I've had some help from other books, from chapter 1, verses 2 to 10, verse 1 being the introduction to the book as a whole. And there are a couple of things in chapter 1 that talk about him rebuking the sea and drying it up, and his wrath is poured out like fire. So that's why I put the picture on the background. He is not a God to be messed with or to take lightly. As Nahum has been very, very clear, he is a God to be feared and a God who deals with us, can deal with us as our sins deserve. So that's the first little chapter. The second bit is moving on in verses 11 to 15. We read these words. Do you want to read those to us, Andy?
There will be a great reversal, destruction, and restoration.
The next slide, which is a verse from chapter 1, if you don't mind, sorry.
From you, Nineveh, has come forth one who plots evil against the Lord. More.
And you click it again.
I, the Lord, will prepare your grave, for you are vile.
Yeah. So what we read about God in chapter 1, we find that in chapter 2, it's clear that there's presumably been a ruler or somebody from Nineveh who has purposefully set out against the Lord and his purposes. And they have allies that are numerous, and this verse talks about they'll be destroyed and pass away. And in the same time, he mentions that in verse 12, although I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles. So you've got this idea, it's very Psalm 2-ish, of the Ninevites under their leader or leaders arrayed against God and devising wicked schemes and plans. But as we see this section panning out, we discover that the Lord will prepare their grave in verse 14, for you are vile. However much they are trying to oppose him, they are going to fail, because it's not like hitting your head against a brick wall, because a brick wall's inanimate, but battling against God is doomed for failure. If we move on to the next slide, we have in these verses, chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, a vivid description of what will happen to Nineveh. And it's quite graphic language, really, and quite staccato in the way that it's written in describing it. Perhaps you could read it to us, Andy. This is a vivid recounting of the sort of thing that's going to happen to the Ninevites.
It is decreed that Nineveh will be exiled and carried away. Her female slaves moan like doves and beat on their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose water is draining away. Stop, stop, they cry, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. The supply is endless, the wealth from all its treasures. She is pillaged, plundered, stripped. Hearts melt, knees give way, bodies tremble, every face grows pale.
So you notice they're very crisp statements, almost like just the person who's writing it, seeing it with his own eyes and recounting what will happen to Nineveh. After this section, there is, if you're reading this book, there's a section from chapter 2, verse 11 to 13. I put 11 to 10 there, it should be 11 to 13, about lions in a den. Now, I think that, well, this is talking about the Ninevites and the Assyrians. You get pictures of them or sculptures of these Assyrians chasing down lions on their chariots. And I think this particular passage is talking about them, how they've been living, and what God will do as a consequence of it. Do you mind reading this one, Andy?
Where now is the lion's den? The place where they fed their young, where the lion and the lioness went, and the cubs with nothing to fear. The lion killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mate, filling his lairs with the kill and his dens with the prey. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard.
So this is talking about the demise of the city of Nineveh, its power, its prosperity, its influence on the surrounding nations. It describes them as lions, sort of safe in their den, happy to feed their young. Lions and lionesses both went there. There was nothing to fear. They had enough food. They got what they wanted and devoured it when and when they wanted it. And God had sort of seen this opulent, self-satisfied, independent sort of way of living, just caring about themselves. He's seen that, and he declares that he's against them and will burn up their chariots. And he's going to remove all the prey so they can't feast off the nations around them. And their messengers will no longer be seen. Nineveh, as I said earlier, is on the edge of Mosul. We sort of passed the center of it, the lament. It's a lament really about the lions. And we get a repetition of sorts of the vivid scene of destruction that will come about on Nineveh. It says, "This woe to the city of blood." This describes what they're like, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords and glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses, all because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and people by her witchcraft. So again, another very sort of staccato description of what Nineveh will be like when God's wrath falls upon it, and it will be attacked in due course by Babylon and the city decimated. So and so as we go through these little things, and this structure I nicked off somebody else, so it's nothing very clever in me using it, but I think it's got a helpful structure to it in helping us see why certain sections are repeated. The Ninevites seem to think that they're better than other people and therefore secure, sort of a city set on a hill that no one can topple. And so having said that he'll destroy it in chapter 11, you know, they can't stand against him. And we read here in chapter 3, verses 8 to 13, a little bit about their attitude and how they aren't safe, even though they think that their empire is one of the mightiest in the region at this time. Do you mind reading this, Andy, please?
Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile with water around her? The river was her defence, the waters her war. Cush and Egypt were her boundless strength. Put and Libya were among her allies. Yet she was taken captive and went into exile. Her infants were dashed to pieces at every street corner. Lots were cast for her nobles, and all her great men were put in chains. You too will become drunk. You too will go into hiding and seek refuge from the enemy.
Yeah, so there we have a description of what happened to Egypt in the past, a one that itself had strong allies, much like Nineveh had, but she went into exile. She thought she was strong. She thought that no one could topple her. That was very stupid thinking and really not an accurate understanding of their situation. And Nineveh has got similar attitude. They think they're secure and strong. They too have got water defenses and all sorts of other things. And the destruction is going to come on them. However secure they think they will be, their demise will just be like the other greats. And we see this in history, don't we? We see empires come and go. We see empires of great influence. The Assyrian Empire was a brutal regime. Some describe it as comparable to ISIS, the things that they did to those that they captured and dealt with. And God is going to deal with them. and for their sins against his people as well. And so in this last little section, we had some verses in the first chapter about God drying up the rivers and sending fire upon those who deserve his wrath and anger. And then right at the end, we read about that fire dropping upon Nineveh herself. She will be caught up in a siege. Verse 15 of the final chapter 3, there the fire will consume you, the sword will cut you down. They will devour you like a swarm of locusts. And right down in verse 19, I think we've got that up here. If I haven't put it up there, I made a mistake. It says, nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? So here's a nation that has dealt severely with every nation that's around them. And when it comes to the day of them being consumed and burnt up, people are going to clap. It's going to be a day of celebration. And we could probably find parallels in history to nations that its power has been overthrown and how people have rejoiced that it's happened. And God is acting in history with these people, or will act in history with these people, because of their endless cruelty. Some major themes in here. One of those is God's judgment. If you click on it, God will punish those who act unjustly and cruelly and act in an evil way. He will bring judgment. In this case, it's going to happen relatively soon, but there will, because of who God is, he will judge all nations, all peoples, for the way that we have responded or not responded to him. So as well as having the theme of God's judgment, there is very clear from the early chapters the theme that God preserves his own people, that he will take care of them. They have suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, but they will come through this and survive the ordeal. And so in chapter 2 and verse 15, these words will be familiar to some of you. Look there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. The wicked there, I think, refers to Assyria being completely destroyed, and no longer will be allowed to have sway over them. God is going to protect his people and keep them for the future. If we just have a look at that in the following slide, fulfill your vows. Click onto that, thank you. You'll notice that the words there are repeated in two other places. We just skip on to the next one. You find them in Isaiah 52, and you'll also find them in Romans 10 and verse 15 about how wonderful are the feet of those who bring good news. And this is a promise for them, I think, then, but ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ, that he comes into a world that is full of evil and cruelty, nations that hold sway. They experienced the wrath of the Romans themselves in Jesus' time, so would have known about that. But Jesus came calling them to himself and to know God through who he was and through what he was doing, and ultimately through his own death and resurrection, bringing them into the people of God who will be preserved by their Father right to the end. And just one other major theme, God setting his people free. It says in Nahum 1, verses 12 to 13, which I think could have been in Jesus's mind when he talked about having the yoke on him. Although I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. And it's a foreshadowing in their own experience of what Jesus will say about coming to him, all of us who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest, and take my yoke upon you. And the yoke of evil he has overcome through his death and resurrection, but he calls us to join him and join others in the work that he's doing. And final thought, the fate of ungodly empires. You may not all agree with this one. Nineveh will not rise again. We know that's true. And just after that, we've got these verses from the very end of the book. When the sun appears, they fly away, and no one knows where. King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? So there is a judgment day, and God in his anger will come for them. And there is a judgment day for us too, when one day he will come to judge us according to the things that have been written about us in his books that recorded his acts. And you may not all agree with this, but there have been nations that have risen up in our living memory who have cast a terrible shadow over great swathes of the world and over multitudes of people. And I'm not pretending that the situation necessarily of Nineveh is the same as to what happened, for instance, to Berlin in the Second World War. But God doesn't sit idly by as the world is in rebellion against him, as rulers do evil things. He, as we see here, has stepped in to act decisively to punish those who are cruel and heartless. And at the end of time, he will judge us all justly for the way that we have lived. And we need to listen to the one who comes to give peace, to the Jesus who is promised in this, and who's seen here on earth, and put our faith in him, who has himself gone through the judgment of God, so that those who trust in him are saved. So that's Nahum, I hope.
Right. I have one interesting thing to throw in, which someone pointed out to me once, that there are two books in the Minor Prophets that end with a question. One of them is Nahum, with this question: who has not felt your endless cruelty? The other one is also a prophet about Nineveh, and that is the book of Jonah. And the question at the end of Jonah is God saying, shall I not also have compassion on this city with all its animals and people? And so you have two books in the Minor Prophets about Nineveh. One, which asks the question about why God isn't allowed to have mercy and forgive the Ninevites. Another, which appeals about the justice of God in judging them in history. So we have, in two ways, we have the judgment and the grace there, both in the Bible, both in the experience of this city, and they're both elements of well, they're both part of the truth about God, aren't they? God is gracious and he is just, and we see guarantees in what happens to Nineveh that God can and will show mercy in the end, and he can and will judge in the end, and neither defeats the other. Both are there, and both are expressions of his character in his goodness and his opposition to evil. And yeah, I've always been struck by this question ever since.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it?
So is Habakkuk about Nineveh?
I don't think so.
No. Which other one is about Nineveh?
It's Jonah.
Jonah. Okay. I thought one of the other prophets focused in on Nineveh, but maybe I'm wrong.
It might get a mention somewhere, but So they certainly better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Oh, maybe the Habakkuk is. I don't know. I haven't read Habakkuk in a little while. I'll have to check that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Colin. That concludes
That's all right.
the antiviral. Until next time, stay close to Jesus. Don't break your computer and end up in space like Colin on his phone. And wash your hands.
Yep.